Thank you for making some time on a Tuesday. We're going to go through some really cool stuff today. We have the privilege at Sponsor Pulse to measure tons and tons of properties, tons and tons of sponsorships, and then also tons and tons of activations, specific campaigns, messages, programs that brands are doing to bring their sponsorships to life. And we get to share some of the things we learned over the last year and a half, but what worked best, what maybe didn't work so well, and add some numbers to some common conversations about topics like women's sports or esports or NIL in the US. So, there'll be plenty of time for questions. There's a Q&A in the webinar window there where you can throw questions. Please, as we go, I'll try to pick some off as they come through, maybe as I'm chatting. At worst, I'll get to them at the end. I'm going to be talking for maybe 30, 45 minutes or so about through our findings. Then I'll try to leave about 15 for a Q&A. If we get a little bit of time back, there's nothing too bad about that on a busy day, which I'm sure it is for many of you. So why are we here today? A quick agenda just so you know what to expect. You can tune out for the parts you don't care about, come back for the part you do care about. We'll do a little warm up and just kind of set the stage as to where the data we're going to talk about is coming from, who's speaking. I'll introduce myself a little more formally and hopefully add a little color there. I'll talk about what our benchmark report is, what we found when we did it. And then I think sometimes the richest stuff, some of the funnest stuff to look at isn't just metrics for properties, isn't just metrics for brand performance, but it's actually seeing which activations consumers responded to. There's always that, as a property brand or an agency executing, there's always that moment of will people click with the way we've brought this sponsorship to market? And it's great to have, case studies from over 180 tested activations to say, well, these are the ones that came to the top, and here's why we think that is. And as I said, we do have a Q&A. Looks like somebody already maybe popped in a question. Sending slides out. Yes, we will be sharing things later. There'll be a recording, there'll be slides, there'll be follow-up links, all that stuff. And of course, if anything you see really catches your eye and you want to go deeper on it, myself, our team, we've got Kat here, Eddie here, Neil, Adam, another Adam, lots of other folks on the team would be happy to, have a deeper conversation. So why are we here today? Just a level set. Sponsorship is big business. I think most of us on the webinar right now work in sponsorship, or at least are interested in sponsorship, but there's been some recent stats that say within the next decade of our lives, it could be $150 million industry, the projected growth. And so we're, talking about an industry that is growing and also massive, but is in a very interesting phase. And, before I get to specific results, we wanted to set the stage about some of the changes that are happening in our industry. First, why do brands invest in sponsorship? We did a bit of research to ask consumers kind of, how they see sponsorships. I think traditionally 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of people saw sponsorship as a brand awareness tool. We're launching a new product, we're launching a new brand, we're breaking into a new marketplace. What better way to announce our presence than to show up at the local baseball diamond or to show up at a music festival? That certainly still is the case, but if you tune into a pro sporting event or go to a music festival, by and large, the brands you're seeing in the space are not brands that you're hearing about for the first time. It's State Farm, it's Canadian Tire if you're up north. And they're, there for a reason, which isn't just to increase your awareness of the brand. We know that sizable portions of the population increase their familiarity of a brand, increase their consideration, or more down funnel behaviors like how they think and feel about these brands. These results vary widely. That's the other kind of spoiler to the story, is we see everything from negative impact to almost universal impact, depending on the fit between the brand, the property, and how they brought it to life. And that's what we'll be talking about for the next 20 so minutes. Lots of things going on. I think, if you subscribe to industry sources, if you're active in the industry and you're hearing people talk, there's lots of things that are making the North American, let's say, sponsorship space a really interesting time. First of all, we've got, like many industries and economies, a globalization factor. It is now extremely possible to live in North America and be a rabid, avid cricket fan and consume it as your number one sport. The access is unparalleled. And that's a challenge as well for domestic sports leagues who may be losing share of attention to some of these global behemoths. So we've got kind of a flatter playing field, OTT, streaming, and then just continued inroads into more content, more sport, more touch points. Second, I think, it's not to labor it, but it's everywhere right now. Brands that have been saying we need to find white space in pro sports. we're about to double our inventory in so many, in some respects, by having the women's sports explosion happen right in front of our eyes. And 2024 and 2023 really is where it became less of a guess and more of a now we can see the growth curve actually happening. Personalities, that's Paige Becker's UConn. She's awesome. She's got deals. I think she's got Nike. I think she's got Gatorade, probably some I'm forgetting. We're now seeing the ability to not necessarily have to pick up a tab for a massive deal with a property, but being able to activate a sport or a passionate fan base by partnering with an individual athlete. Content, I think, when we talk about the different ways fans can engage, it's not just watching the live event anymore, whether it's content series, things on Netflix like Drive to Survive, those are exploding and allowing, properties both to grow their reach, but also providing additional exposure for sponsors and different opportunities and ways to show up. And then often, sports commands, depending on the number, depending on the marketplace, 70–80% of sponsorship spend. Increasingly, brands are saying, well, how do I reach consumers who aren't sports fans? I can sponsor every sport in the world, but if you're not a sports person, I don't have a passion point where I connect with you. So music festivals, cause, community, lifestyle, fitness, on and on and on. We're continuing to see those portfolios for big brands evolve beyond sport and start to say, how do we bring the expertise that we've executed in sport into those spaces? All good things, right? We've got some challenges at the same time. We surveyed industry professionals, so brands, properties, agencies, those who are in between. 7 in 10 said basically their single biggest challenge is valuation. How much is this actually worth? Is it 5 million or 50? I think we all feel that if we work in the industry, it's not necessarily a tangible, you don't sign a sponsorship and the next day inventory arrives at your office and you sell it and you know exactly how much money you made off it. And even, kind of maybe another headwind is that there's not necessarily the strongest trust between buyers and sellers. Can I trust that what I'm getting or that what I'm being offered as a brand is what I want? So we know that the industry's growing, we're in a great space, but at the same time, we've got headwinds of the fundamental transaction between a brand and a property is at the same time not as strong as we may want it to be. Who are we? So I'm Adam Garreau. I lead customer success here at Sponsor Pulse. I've been working in North America for about 15 years on sponsorship, and I won't labor this. I'll get into the good stuff quickly, but who we are, we have a data-driven and a consumer-first approach to sponsorship. So we help brands and properties or agencies who are working in between either identify the opportunity for a sponsorship, value it, and get the number right, no-go territory, sweet spot, undervalued, what is the right answer, figuring out the best way to activate, which will be where we shine a lot of light today, and then ultimately are we returning on outcomes? Are consumers feeling, thinking, and buying differently because we showed up with a property they care about? Couple quick hits just so you understand what the data I'm sharing is and what it isn't. We're sponsorship focused. Our parent company IMI has been around for 40+ years doing all sorts of fantastic market research, strategy, measurement, consulting. The Sponsor Pulse piece is exclusively focused on connecting brands and properties with the data they need on sponsorship. The data you'll see is from consumer research surveys. The numbers are big. If you care about sample size, we're talking hundreds of thousands of respondents collected over the last 12 to 18 months. A lot of what we do is 13 to 16 64-year-olds, sorry. So one of the great things we love to be able to take to brands, whether they're CPG, finance, automotive, is to say, here's what's happening with 13 to 17-year-olds. Often not part of the strategic landscape and sometimes tougher to access. There are tons of ways you can measure a sponsorship. You can focus on earned media value, quality of exposures, business, hospitality, employee engagement. All of those matter when you sign the big check, but we are focused on whether consumers know you're there, care you're there, and are they changing their attitudes or behavior as a result of you showing up where they care. And part of what we're talking today is benchmarks. We have the privilege to measure hundreds and hundreds of sponsorships. So when we get a result that says 41% for a given metric, we're able to say, how does that compare to other automotive brands? Or how does that compare to other players in the women's sports space to provide that context for decision makers? All right. Let's dive in. I'm going to switch just over to our platform and start talking about the benchmark report here. All right. I hope everybody can see that. Somebody throw something in the Q&A if the question is, I can't see your screen, but I think I'm good. So welcome to Sponsor Pulse. There's a couple of resources I'm going to be taking you through today. First of all is our platform, which the homepage is up on the screen right now. I quoted a couple stats as well, just so you know about like the industry and what professionals think about the trajectory. You can also go to stateofsponsorship.com. It's a study we did that has all sorts of cool stats about, what growth areas the industry sees, what consumers are tired of, what assets are winning, what assets are losing. So that's another just resource in case you're interested. But I'll start here on our platform. There's tons and tons of data that you can access here, miniature reports, but we're here for one reason, which is the benchmark report. So I'm going to dive into that. If you like what you see and what I'm talking about, find it interesting, want to grab these stats for yourself, the benchmark report is free. All you need to do is make a free account on our platform. No transaction needed. You can do exactly what I am doing as I click around and talk to you today. You can grab the numbers, you can screenshot it, share it, whatever. We talked about the industry, so I'm going to lead off by just saying we kind of understand the fundamental that measurement and value is one of the hardest parts of this equation. How do we approach it at Sponsor Pulse? So we talk to consumers. This is first party data. We're talking to people and asking them about their passions and the brands they use, the brands they're going to buy, and what sponsorship activation they notice in the marketplace. So we start with property health. If I'm a crypto brand, probably not the best example, but you'll see some crypto stuff later. I want to know, are people who are interested in crypto potentially engaging with this property? Or am I fishing where the fish are? Is there alignment between our two businesses? Also, is that property healthy? Does it have more fans, so to speak, than it did 5 years ago? Is it growing with the segments I care about? Then we go to the holy grail, which is if you've got 1,000, pick your property, NCAA basketball fans, and I say, what brands do you associate with NCAA basketball? The holy grail is having consumers play back the brand that you're sponsoring. Oh, AT&T. Coming off the tip of the tongue of a fan shows that we've done something. Now, not every brand's going to break through unaided. We'll acknowledge, obviously, those who spend a lot for frequency and to hammer home that they're a sponsor are usually the ones that win there. But the wins that come are when we see growth in those metrics 2, 3, 4 times as big over the course of 3, 4, 5 years, because we know for sure something real is happening with that fan base. And then we get into aided awareness. It's a test. Do you know that this brand sponsors this property? Once we've got a pool of people who fit, kind of our dream pool, they're engaged with a property, and we can ask them the question, do you know this brand's involved? Once they raise their hand to say yes, we start diving on impact. We look at whether their perceptions of the brand are changing. That can be everything from, is a brand that supports my community, delivers great value, cares about things I care about. We look at general brand love. Do you just like this brand? Obviously, many of the big spenders in sponsorship are telecoms and banks, which sometimes are not the easiest brands to love, depending on how consumers feel. And then we also look at what we'll call purchase intent, but I want to be clear, many sponsors are looking for retail visitation, not necessarily purchase or usage of an app or a service. So we'll call it purchase, but I want to be clear that that fits kind of all. And then importantly for us, we look at how those outcomes were built. If we've got a pool of people with elevated consideration for brand X, we want to know what activations, what assets were responsible for delivering that outcome. And then we look at cost effectiveness. How much did we spend to get there? So let's start at the top. I mentioned property engagement and property health. How many people can I reach? So if we just talk general population in North America, not specific leagues at this point, but just the entire kind of pie chart of our industry, it's no surprise that the biggest, most wide-reaching piece, and that's why they command the premiums they do, is pro sports. Within local markets, that can often play out as teams, right? So if I'm in Texas, the Houston Astros, maybe the Texas Rangers, but pro sports leagues themselves reach typically on average about 50% of the population for the big ones with the shields that we all consume all the time. Up next, in terms of potential reach in the population, about 4 in 10 people engage with global events. I'm talking Olympics, FIFA World Cup. Obviously, that's coming to North America. That number will probably change. But close on those heels is other ways that sports comes to life in the marketplace. Slams and majors, from the Masters to the US Open, talking tennis in that instance. Then to collegiate sports. Obviously, there's tons of talk about what's playing out in collegiate sports right now. And then to the combat sport arena, whether it's UFC, major boxing matches, etc. We do currently see the reach for other properties in the space being around 1 in 3 consumers. So if even we start at the bottom, talking about esports and gaming, up to music events and concerts, obviously there's been a massive explosion in the number of festivals you can attend, especially in the United States recently. But realistically, still we're talking about a third of the population who's in that pool. Women's sports is growing. I think we know. You don't need me to tell you that. It's already reaching 1 in 3 people in the population. And I mean, depending on the league, that's just poised to continue growing. Community events and racing round out those that are kind of in the 1 in 3 territory. So what do we take away from this? We already know that if we want to get together with a pro sports franchise, we're paying for reach. We're paying for that universal air game, high ratings, etc. It doesn't mean that for commiserate spend, we can't activate against music or gaming or community and achieve amazing outcomes. In fact, arguably, there's more to the equation, but if we were just doing some simple math to say, how much do I have to pay to sponsor the biggest pro sports leagues versus how much do I have to pay to sponsor music festivals or women's sports? If it's 30% versus 50% reach, often that's not the same equation on the spend that's necessary to get there. So there's cost effectiveness opportunities when we do pick up and piece together a portfolio with those different pieces that reach into the population. I'm going to talk about what we measured. So we kind of like laid out the landscape, acknowledge that pro sports is king, we get it, but that there's opportunities elsewhere. We surveyed 100,000 consumers or customers of various brands, representative to the general population by age, gender, income, region. We measured in 2023 over 350 or over 370, unique sponsorships. That means anytime brand X was a partner of property Y, that strength of connection and the outcomes were measured. And we measured nearly 1,000 activations. So an example, I know activation is kind of a fuzzy word. This could be something when a brand does a 30-second spot with some players or some personalities from a certain sports league. It could be showing up in an experiential way at a music festival, or it could be running a community impact piece where we're donating to help people get on the ice or get onto the baseball diamond in our communities. Before we get into kind of what won, how does this go? When you have, does pro sports include women's sports? Great question that just came through. Thank you, Grace. For us, because we wanted to shine a light on women's sports, we have separated them. I want to be abundantly clear. We recognize that pro sports as a title is not necessarily saying women's sports aren't pro sports, but we have called out women's sports separately and kept then pro sports as its own category with the women's sports things emerging. We may blend those in the future. We may rebrand pro sports as men's sports, but that's kind of the separation that's going to be in these results. Thank you for the question. So before we get into kind of where we saw the best impact or the lowest impact in some cases, we want to talk just general. What can sponsorship do? Does it drive brand outcomes? I think hopefully if you're here, you believe it or are waiting to be convinced. But some simple numbers across these thousands of case studies include that the average sponsorship, if you take everybody who engages with one of these properties, for us that can include watching on TV, attending in person, streaming, following on social. We're agnostic to how you fan, but we count you all in the same pool of people who touch the property. So if you take ATP tennis, for example, and say everybody who follows that sport, however they choose to, in person, streaming, following their favorite tennis player on social, often those things are overlapped, but it is what it is. About the typical brand sponsorship will get recognized and be acknowledged by about half of that audience. Half will say, I did not know that was a sponsor of my favorite thing or my thing, but about half is the rough middle of the road. That's what we get on average. Now, I want to be clear, those numbers can swing wildly, and we'll get into that in a minute. Once we get that kind of half, so if we take all our tennis fans or we take all our people who go to Coachella, or all the people who are passionate about St. Jude's Hospital, get them, move out half. Okay, you didn't know I was activating, but I've got 50% left in the room who did recognize my brand sponsorship on average. About 40% of those who remain feel better to the brand. And so, when we start to talk about how big these properties are, that's some sizable math in terms of what this technique as a marketing tactic can do. And we get about 36% or 1 in 3 who can say they're increasing their consideration of that brand, whether it's using, visiting, buying, etc. So if that's just the average result compared to some other marketing tactics, that's pretty powerful. It's a funnel, but at the same time, we end up with a lot of people in the room who've left with a positive impression of the brand. But that has a massive spread. If we go that aided awareness number that I said was 50-50 roughly on average, we see sponsorships all the time that reach less than 10% of that audience. And I'm not talking about being unfair to a local brand or an associate sponsor that just has a very small spend. We're talking brands that are spending. And that can go up to the high 80%. There's those title partnerships, those long-standing brands that have been around for 20, 30 years, who virtually everybody who touches that property also knows are there. So there's a 74% spread in terms of awareness results, and a similarly big spread on results for impact. So we're going to get into why that spread exists and who's kind of at the top of that and who's not. So if we have these three key metrics and we kind of want to talk about who wins the day in each, I'm going to go 3 columns here. So the first column's recognition. Do fans of these properties recognize sponsors? That's awareness. The middle column in green is going to be favorability. Which ones drive that brand love for their sponsors? And the last one's going to be purchase intent. Do we ultimately ring the cash register? When we looked at all the properties we measured in 2023, collegiate sports sponsorships were the best at delivering awareness for their partners. It's that perfect mix, we think, to offer some commentary there. It is certainly quasi-professional. I know it's not professional in a legal sense, but certainly the media attention and the quality of the production is on the same level as the pro game. I'm very focused on the US here. I know I'm talking North America, but I'm definitely talking NCAA when I say these things in terms of their reach in the population. But at the same time, they've got incredible passion. There is no more passionate fan base than somebody cheering on their alma mater, than somebody cheering on their hometown college sports team. It's rare to capture that somewhere else. So it's not a surprise that their sponsors get recognized. Amongst those who do follow esports, those who have gotten in early and showed commitment early come in number 2. Then we get pro sports. So again, as much as it's a reach vehicle, sponsors are coming along for the ride. We often hear pro sports is too cluttered. There's too many sponsors. Well, they come in 3rd place for driving recognition of their brand sponsors. It also helps that the brands that sign up to sponsor pro sports spend tens of millions of dollars making sure that they're sponsoring. We get racing and music in the top 5 position. Brands that sponsor music are recognized by about half of the audience there. If we set aside awareness for a second and just say, okay, well, now what about the heartstrings and the wallet? Do we drive impact once we're recognized? It's probably not a surprise that community-focused sponsorships lead the way in terms of driving brand favorability, but only 1 point behind women's sports properties. It's not to suggest that women's sports properties are a charitable initiative, but the data would suggest that they can be as powerful in demonstrating what a brand is trying to say to the marketplace with all the benefits of sports. Community sponsorships often have to be at a grassroots level. Charitable events often happen only once a year. Their frequency as a marketing solve is not that high, typically. 1 weekend a year, there's a marathon, or there's a charity drive in October. Sports, part of the reason they're so expensive to sponsor is because they're, games on Tuesday, Thursday, we got the championship, we got the playoffs, we got the draft, we got the draft lotto, we got the on and on and on. So the fact that women's sports is already in a 2nd position alongside, more charitable initiatives that we measure is already showing the benefit that brands get. Collegiate sports isn't far behind. Esports and gaming isn't far behind, and those domestic kind of high watermarks for slams and majors come in next. It's a similar list, jostling a little bit on purchase consideration. The one thing we'll say is we will highlight some esports sponsorships that do extremely well amongst that audience. Everything here is about that property's audience. So that's not to say an esports sponsorship can rival an NFL partnership in the general population, but about the effectiveness once we get to that audience and we know we're talking to a fan. So now let's get into, I don't want to say we're handing out awards, it's not an awards show, but we're definitely happy to share some of the top performing. So if we go these will tie into the themes I just hit earlier. If we go which properties in our data have fan bases that are the best at recognizing their sponsors. NCAA basketball is number 1. I want to be clear, this is even before the 2024 tournaments. So this was last year's tournament, which still had awesome things happening, but this year's was a wholly different set of the March Madnesses. The sponsors who've been there often have been there for a long time and also have a perfect window to activate. If you go into consumer marketing and campaigns, setting sponsorship aside, you'll often see marketers talk about a 4 to 6 week window. that's when we're going to run this promotion. That's when we're going to run this campaign. It's going to be about 4 to 6 weeks. Well, what does NCAA basketball deliver during a fantastic kind of quieter part of the calendar every year? It delivers a 4 to 6 week tournament where the whole country is engaged, and the whole world, frankly. So it's maybe not a surprise that when you sign up to get involved with NCAA basketball, leveraging that nice fit in terms of cadence, program length, it gives you a chance to roll something out in a good part of your calendar, that you get recognized. Interestingly, NASCAR, which used to be the poster child for clutter, somebody who's not a fan would tune in and say, look at that car. How can you recognize any of these brands? There's 75 million logos on the car. Their fans recognize and know who's sponsoring which of these teams. In fact, they often wear merchandise covered with it too. So NASCAR is in second place, and then the NFL. We know that the NFL is a massive reach driver, but their fans know who their sponsors are. And then we get to NCAA football and the NBA. So yes, these are some of the most expensive properties that you could sponsor in the United States, but there's probably for a reason their sponsors get recognized. They've got that level of reach and frequency that drives that home. If we set aside reach for a second and say, well, maybe I'm a brand who's never going to sponsor one of those 5 properties, but still wants to win. Some of the strongest impact that we saw comes from some surprising places, depending on your attitudes. So, one thing we know is that, well, we can get tons of reach with the leagues. Teams in their local market are the passion point more often than not, right? The NFL has done a great job through fantasy football and the content calendar of making everybody an NFL fan and caring about the backup tight end on a team they don't cheer for because they're on their fantasy team, or they have a prop bet on them. Other sports and leagues haven't necessarily cracked that code quite to the same extent, and you typically are watching your favorite team play, cheering for them. Their roster, but the rest of the league's kind of the foils to your favorite team. Net, what we're going to say here is that impact is exceptionally strong for teams that are playing well. The Astros, the Rangers top the list, 2 Texas teams that have had some success in recent years. What comes right after that, though, is indeed a sports league, and it's the NWSL. The second highest impact we measured for sponsors in 2023 came for NWSL sponsors on average. Then we get a couple community events, Pride festivals, those who've activated Pride, as well as the Boston Marathon. We're talking something that's not obviously a massive national property that's on TV, 99 times a year, but among those who follow that property, sponsors get recognized. We've also got the biggest and baddest, which is FIFA. Obviously that wouldn't be here if we looked at 2024. It's not a evergreen every year event, but we'll show you some of the activations that won there. In the driving purchase category, you can see NWSL actually tops the list, along with some high performing sports teams and sports properties. So again, kind of hits the themes we already talked about, but maybe some surprises there. And already we're able to say we acknowledge that, the WNBA, for example, doesn't yet have the TV ratings and attendance that the NBA has. Nobody, I think, is out there expecting that right now. But we can already say that when you partner with a women's sports league, the conversion from awareness to impact is much stronger than those other opportunities. They're big opportunities. And as we see women's sport engagement grow and ratings grow and attendance grow, whether they can maintain that strong conversion remains to be seen. But for now, the data, without going fishing for it, is already pushing women's sports properties into the top of the list in terms of typical sponsorship impact. One thing I'll talk about as I go to brands is quickly, when you tune into a baseball game or go to a music festival, it's interesting to see how things have changed over the last 10 years. We've seen an explosion in CPG brands, official toothpaste, official soap, official razor, official cereal bar. Not just because properties are closing more categories, but because sponsorship, which may have traditionally been seen as, hey, this is a great way to, reward the clientele of my bank, or advertise my telecommunications firm, has become a short-term play as well. And when I mean short-term, I'm not talking about length of the deal. I'm talking about the purchase cycle. So consumables. In the UK, they say fast-moving consumer goods. In North America, we say CPG, consumer packaged goods. So, interestingly, when we split the data, the results were they're 1 or 2 points away for the awareness delivered to consumable, QSR, CPG, type brands as they were for long-term brands, hard goods, services. And, even if the purchase intent was a little higher for short-term, it's very, very similar. So we want to show from the mountaintops that, there is no kind of hurdle to a brand with any type of potential consumer story using sponsorship to get outcomes. And, we'll talk about which categories kind of did the best in our data. It's probably no surprise, every sport, maybe with the exception of sumo wrestling, has to have some kind of uniform. I'm racking my brain there. We'll just stick with that. And so apparel companies spend tons of money to dress the players. I mean, I know I'm stating the obvious. Those sponsorships are by and far the most recognized. Apparel brands, we include them. I know they're endemic. I know Nike and basketball isn't the same thing as Kia and basketball, but they do dominate, and allows us to kind of see how good is good. When in our consulting practice, we see a brand that's starting to kick on the heels of a Nike level association with sports, and they sell business software, they're doing something exceptional because of how endemic those brands are. But number two in driving awareness is grocery brands, all the stuff you see in the grocery store. Then we get energy drinks, delivery services, your DHLs, your FedExes, your UPSs, and credit cards. It's a mixed bag. In terms of who's getting the most impact, in terms of brand favorability, you can see sports betting is in there, QSR, personal care, luxury goods. I think, what impresses upon us, even if the differences are only 1 or 2 percentage points, is just how varied it is and how brands of any category can get outcome. One thing that's not in here that doesn't crack the top 5 is NFTs and crypto. We do see pushback from consumers. We've all followed the rise and fall of those in the sponsorship space. But interestingly, as we get later and talk about one of the strongest activations we measured, we do have an example of an incredibly effective and well-received crypto integration into Formula One. And we'll hit that. But obviously, if you want to know if this is the top 5, Adam, if you kept scrolling, what would be at the bottom? There's a hint of an answer. So now let's get into specific brands. And this is where I get kind of excited, because a lot of these partnerships either confirm things we feel about what brands are doing. I'm talking Red Bull, there for a second, but also can surprise us to say, really, that was one of the strongest results that you measured in the last year. That's really eye-opening. So if we talk about who is most likely as a brand when they sponsor something, and in Red Bull, it's a bit blurry because they often don't just sponsor something, they do something. They make a F1 car, they send somebody to space. But I think it's important for us to continue measuring Red Bull, even if they aren't just your typical official energy drink of the XYZ. They often do their own thing and they often benefit for it, but it costs a lot of money to race an F1 car and hire engineers to build one. But they top the list. So where Red Bull is involved, they are recognized leagues above many other brands, whether it's in F1, whether it's in esports, wherever they show up, they have always been flying their own flag and doing it their way. And they generate on average 73% reach within those fan bases. So, you have almost universal awareness when Red Bull is involved with a property. The next 3 are kind of, I don't want to say duh, but brands that do extremely well when they get involved with a property. Gatorade, when involved, consumers recognize it. It's an automatic fit. And then the 2 apparel brands. I'll set those aside, not because they're not great performing and not, somehow not interesting, but I think we would expect them to top the list. What's powerful for us is who then comes next. To see FedEx, who's not necessarily a brand that everybody touches on a daily basis, it doesn't taste great like a Coca-Cola or a Bud Light, to see them and the level of recognition they've got a portfolio that's maybe fewer better in terms of what they sponsor. And when they show up, 68% of consumers recognize them as a sponsor of that property. Up next is probably the gold standard in sponsorship, Coca-Cola, who activate incredibly well, incredibly global, and they're recognized heavily when they show up. Then we get AT&T and Visa, which is fantastic to see, 2 more service, long-term categories, who do very well with either March Madness or FIFA. And then there's Bud Light. And Bud Light's very interesting. A lot of different things happening with that brand, which we may touch on a little bit later, in terms of good and bad, but they are heavily recognized. And rounding out that top list is Verizon, a brand that's been involved with many big sports properties over the year. They have exceptional awareness when they show up. Why are these brands here? It's a combination of fit, quality of selection of the properties they sponsor. And then let's be honest, they spend a lot of money making sure that people know they're sponsors. They don't keep it a secret, they activate and they do meaningful things. When we go to who gets the biggest brand impact, yes, I'll kind of set the apparel brands to the side and say, hey, if you make the shirt or the shoes that the player wears and you also sell those things, people are going to be attracted to those things. But you see Chick-fil-A, who is obviously a well-loved brand for many people in the United States, has some NCAA plays, has some other sponsorships. They get massive benefit in the not necessarily massive sponsorship portfolio that they've developed. Then we get to EA Sports with natural product integration, Subway, NFL, lots of other sponsorships, MasterCard. So Visa was great on reach. Maybe MasterCard we're saying is a little stronger on impact, at least in some of the data we looked at. And then I know many people from the call are saying you keep talking about North America and the States. We are based in Toronto. I am Canadian. I do want to call out we're same ruler in both countries. TD and Canadian Tire, and now if you're American, you're like, okay, maybe no TD, Canadian Tire, not so much. But anyways, they crack the top of the list. So there are Canadian brands doing work in Canada who are, going toe to toe in terms of quality of results on driving impact with consumers, as any of these big global brands do in the United States. And then we get Target, and kind of a shuffled list on consideration, which is our other impact metric, but many of the same players. One I'll call out as well is a brand that didn't exist, I don't want to say 10 years ago, but stick with me on, I could Wikipedia it, but I don't want to slow down. How long has DoorDash been around? But obviously not a product we all grew up with, depending on your age. It is possible to drive exceptional impact for a new emerging category and be up there with retail, financial, carbonated soft drinks. So that's kind of what we'll talk about there. I'm going to speed up a bit and this is the end of kind of this piece before I go deep on some activations. So if we know which sponsorships have had excellent outcomes, sorry, are there any? I missed a couple questions. I'll get them at the end. I want to make sure. Thank you for asking, but I'll try to tackle them all at the end. If we know which sponsorships are working well, the question is why? Not just spend, but what are they saying to consumers about what they're doing? And some of the top activations that we measured, I want to be clear what we mean by top. It either has exceptional recognition, meaning that the fans know about this aspect to the execution of the sponsorship, or those who are aware of it have extremely elevated consideration for the brand who did it. I'm going to run through each of these in order and talk about some themes with the next 10-ish minutes before I throw to questions, but you'll see them here. I'm going to go one by one, and that ends kind of the benchmark report, at least on the platform. So I'm going to switch over to this and talk about each of these activations and why we think they may have topped the list. Then one of the strongest, it's almost, calling it an activation may be doing a disservice to the term, but Adidas owning MLS and having been there since 2004 is almost recognized by every single fan. The awareness is off the charts that Adidas is the official kit and ball supplier of MLS. I want to be clear, though, it's not just a merchandising deal that's been signed. There's all sorts of activations that drive solid impact for which is an activation that has exceptional awareness. They support future generations of players. They have inclusivity plays. They even have something as tactical as, Adidas has a loyalty program. You buy products, you earn points. You can redeem those for MLS season pass. So they're even delivering consumer value, not to mention you're probably wearing an Adidas shirt if you're an MLS fan. That was one of the highest awareness activations we have ever tested in terms of a fan base correctly saying, yes, I know that fact, which is ultimately a business deal. Adidas and MLS get together, sign a deal. Not every fan, that's not necessarily relevant to every fan's life, but the awareness is through the roof. I don't want to rank these because they all do different things, but I'll say the second kind of most compelling in the data activation out of nearly 1,000 was Visa and the FIFA Women's World Cup. They were, the first women's focused FIFA partner, which goes back to 2021, which is now 3 years ago, even though it feels like it was yesterday. So in terms of credibility, to not be, just coming in lately on this, only 3 years, but at the same time, they were first. They then tied it very intelligently, not just celebrating the players, not just celebrating the event, but to find opportunities to give grants from 5 to 50K, one for every match in the FIFA Women's World Cup, and they sponsor individual players. So this checks a couple boxes, and our data set delivered exceptional impact for Visa and has strong awareness as well as a campaign. Keep in mind they're doing a few things here. They're investing in women's sports. They're investing in individual players, some of which you can see on my screen, And they're also finding a way to give back and give to the community with a nice thematic. 64 matches, 64 grants, women-owned small businesses, and then they talk about it. They're not afraid to spend and tell the world that they're doing it. We'll get to something else. I want to say, like, a lot of this, sometimes depending on who you are, the size of your property, the size of your brand, you go, yeah, I might not be able to do 64 business grants with an international campaign. And it's like, we hear you. What's really cool to me, and what should be very cool to some properties that are listening or working with us, is that a couple of the top 10 aren't, I don't want to say off the shelf, but they're not exactly, you know, multi-million-dollar integrated marketing campaigns with massive causal execution components. So for example, one of the strongest amongst baseball fans, one of the strongest activations for driving consideration for a brand was DraftKings having your classic home run derby, hit it here. So, you know, an offer is unlocked if somebody hits a dinger to a certain section, and that offer is basically some free credit at a sports book and some prizes. So, you know, as much as that may not win the Cannes Lion for most innovative marketing campaign, it's a tried and true asset that delivers value to the consumer, and in our data showed exceptional gains in consideration. You know, we're gamifying some of the home run derby, which is already a fantastic moment, taking a classic asset and then triggering something of consumer value when that asset is hit. Another top 10 for us was Nike and the FaZe Clan and the LeBron sneakers. So, you know, a natural kind of, you know, driver consideration if you like those sneakers. I don't think they would fit my personal style, but they are, you know, for the right audience, very cool. What better way to launch a collaboration than having LeBron James wear them on the court? So he wore them versus Cleveland, and he was at the Cleveland game with I don't know if anybody saw last night, LeBron was at the Cleveland game. They let him have a full bottle of wine courtside under his legs. I thought that was like a little interesting. I don't think that any of us would be allowed to do that, but I guess if you're LeBron. Keep in mind, you know, this is esports audience, so they're very attracted to this idea. FaZe Clan's a big player there. And then also his son, Bronny, who's, basketball fan. His vertical just came out and all his stats for the draft just came out. So Bronny's top of mind. He's been involved with the FaZe Clan for 4 or 5 years now. So that was incredibly impactful. Getting out of the esports space, just being about energy drinks and snacks and things like that and peripherals, and getting into the basketball space and bringing two properties together. Also in the top 10 was MasterCard and the NWSL. What we've got here is the best 11. And so, you know, this is a monthly award plus an annual award. So think of it as kind of like, you know, top players. What's important for us is obviously that's an asset that likely would have a sponsor. So I don't want to suggest that it's boring or not interesting, but they took it further, which includes a content series. And so what you'll see on some of these kind of winners that are not maybe the most innovative, crazy campaigns is that they've taken an asset and then made sure it's supported with content. So if you win this award, if you're named to this starting lineup, you're also often on a podcast telling stories, also presented by MasterCard. They were second, MasterCard was second only to Nike in driving brand favorability amongst NWSL sponsors. They're a credit card company, not necessarily a soda brand that you love drinking or beer or things like that. You know, they're a financial services company. It's not easy to be up there with Nike necessarily, and you do it by celebrating players. Another one is, I think if you want to talk cool and innovative, I think this is definitely an activation we saw that deserves those topic. They partnered with Amex did with Break the Love, which is a social sports platform. Amex is all about access, so this is no surprise if you're familiar with things they've done in sponsorship before. But you know, if you've got an Amex, getting access to court times in New York City is pretty friggin' cool. And peak tennis times too. You're not doing your first serve at 4 in the morning just because you couldn't get anything else. They even threw in pickleball, which I would be remiss if I didn't have a sports and entertainment discussion in 2024 without saying the word pickleball at least once. That'll be the only time I probably say it, but it included pickleball as well. And you know why this topped our list is Amex has been active with the US Open for now 30 years, including things like the radio call in your ear. But now they've also partnered with an emerging app to say, let's get people on the court. It's smart stuff. People who were reached by this program showed exceptional impact in our research. Getting a little more fun. If you pull these spots up on YouTube, you'll see they're just classic cases of leveraging players for fun advertising. So HEB's like the go-to grocery in Texas, their beloved commercials, and they do a lot of them. There will often be a reel, 5, 6, 7 a season, and they're skits. They're funny. This goes back to, all the great humorous spots we've all loved. There's a classic HEB one with Vince Wilfork, I think, if you remember, with him in some overalls. I know a 30-second spot with players is not necessarily, going to set the world on fire, but in our data, tried and true works. These have strong impact, even not amongst hardcore fans of these teams, just in the local market amongst Gen Pop, and as well for that marketplace. There's this year's campaign included a healthy dose that were Spanish with English subtitles. So also speaking to multicultural markets in Texas. I said I'd talk crypto. They maybe didn't top the list in terms of things, fans love or want to see more of. But interestingly, an asset that probably would exist and find a sponsor is the Overtake of the Month content series. So, you've got something here. Racing's all about overtaking, or it should be, at least when they get the regulations right. And somebody's probably going to put their name on this, but crypto.com has kind of married it with their brand purpose. They're a challenger. They're looking to overtake. And it was interesting to see how this evolved even in the 3-4 years that this program's been running. Originally, it was an award handed out at the end of the season to whichever driver just had the most overtakes during the season. So you had 71 overtakes. Here's your trophy. They've intelligently pivoted to a fan voted award that's more so like the best, most meaningful, coolest overtake. And also that's typically presented live to the person on the paddock, and they have an interview and content like that. So, taking an asset, if I had ran a racing series, I'd probably find a sponsor for pole sitter, most overtakes, fastest lap of the day, etc. But making it about, your brand's purpose, finding a fit there, and then supporting it with content, really pushed this into the top of the list for a brand which, frankly, in 2023, it wasn't easy to love crypto brands, but here we have a crypto brand in our top 10 activations in terms of driving consideration, which is rare for crypto. Another tennis. I don't play tennis, so I promise I didn't stack the deck. A more traditional community-focused one topped our list. We've got JP Morgan or Chase, as they, depending on, where they show up. They partner with the USTA to give grants in local communities. And I want to, call out that it's $325,000. It's not $20 million. This is the level that many brands can afford to invest at, even if they're a massive one. And this drove, amongst those who are aware of the Return the Serve grants and how they connect with that program to get kids playing, it drove exceptional awareness. So obviously tennis fans very much want to see the sport sustain and grow. And when you invest there, people recognize it. Last one, and then I'll get to questions. So rounding out kind of our top 10 activations is maybe some of you have tasted it. You can't say that about some of the other activations I just talked about. So maybe you actually had this and had it. One of the flavors that Coca-Cola's creations have done, which is the League of Legends, which is Riot Games, special limited edition flavor. Coca-Cola's been doing these on their own. There's AI flavor, the one that was supposed to taste like space. They're also doing partnerships on these special flavors. So not only do we have a special brand can, a special flavor that's supposed to taste like leveling up in a video game, they also integrated in the game itself. So through this program, you could unlock emotes, which is like when your character does a dance or does a gesture. And interestingly, we saw Coca-Cola splash all over the place on the top 10 list. When we say who's been involved with esports, 2014. Coca-Cola first got involved with League of Legends 10 years ago. So for many brands who may be still sitting in a boardroom going, maybe we should do something in esports, Coca-Cola was investing 10 years ago to build credibility with these fans. So then when 10 years later, they come up with a customized flavor, it's the culmination of a lot of investment and activation and continuity. I'll be quick and then get to questions. Out of the top 10 that I just went through, we saw 10 different properties. There were 2 tennis, but slightly different properties. So there's no, well, to win, you got to do this. You got to do hockey in Canada and football in the States. There's none of that. Some of the strongest activations we saw weren't from the biggest properties. I think 3 arguably emphasized community investment and access to sport. I think that's telling compared to the massive list of activations. 3, at the same time, leverage traditional assets. 30-second TV spots with players, giving away an award for the best overtake, giving away, naming a starting lineup of the best players in the NWSL. And so, there's a mix of both incredibly creative things that would need a high-powered maybe agency to come on board and build a program, with things that are, properties have at the ready for brands to activate. Two, activated women's sports. I'm, in terms of a share, already 2 of the top 10 are coming from that space, and it's just getting started. But 2 came from esports as well, and 2 featured product activation, the sneakers and the Coca-Cola. So there's some themes there. If you want to say, what didn't work so well, what wasn't on that list, a lot of stuff that just kind of, was more passive, naming something, no activation. Campaigns that didn't necessarily have as big a purpose. So, you can see what kind of bubbles up and added to the portfolio can be powerful. I'm going to get to questions. I think you've heard me ramble on and kind of heard the theme of what we talked about is, I'd say our data supports that esports and women's sports have arrived. If you were talking about them as emerging, the data supports now that they're incredibly effective marketing vehicles. Now what's maybe scary is they're gaining reach. So, if they've been relatively niche in past, now they're bringing this leveled up impact game and they're growing their reach. So that's interesting. Brands are still winning with traditional properties. I don't want to just focus on the shiny new toy. NFL was there, NCAA basketball, you name it, you saw it. And when brands activate content, meaning, purpose, giving back, they win. And every category is there. Doesn't matter what size your brand is, doesn't matter what category you're in. DoorDash, 30-year-old brand, or sorry, DoorDash, maybe 10, some other brand that might be 30, 40, 50 years old, they're all getting outcomes that are very strong. I am going to go to questions now, and then I will answer those after I take a sip of water. But we got 7 minutes here, and thank you for the people who fired away questions. Otherwise, this part of the webinar would be awkward because there would be no questions, so thank you. Okay, question 1 from anonymous attendee. So that's obviously an auto-generated name. Are there any metrics on B2B brands? Yes. They may not have cracked the top list, and I think we know when we're consumer focused, the reality is it's a much smaller part of the population who, necessarily care about AWS versus Salesforce versus Cognizant. But we do measure B2B brands. We tend to, look a little different at those and look at high income decision makers, software decision makers, things like that. So yes, there is learning from B2B, but typically just because of the limited number of decision makers for those categories, when we're talking about what brands get recognized, they don't tend to be in the top 4 or 5. But we'd love to connect. You're anonymous, but if you want to follow up with our team, we can send B2B case studies, etc. Any data on P&G and women's sports? Great question. Not sure exactly what sponsorship, when I think of them, I always think right away to Olympics, but we will be, and maybe I'm trying to read your mind and failing to do so, but we will be going big on a couple upcoming sports properties. So, well, as much as this is looking backwards, we're about to drop our PWHL report with a focus on Canada. So for those who are interested in the explosion in women's hockey, we will be talking about that. We've got Paris 2024 coming up. So all this kind of data will be available for that. And then it's not that far away that we'll be looking at FIFA in a big way. So short answer is yes, there's more than what I highlighted here. If there's a brand, a property, or a type of activation you'd love to know more about, we have an awesome team, more than just me, who have access to this data or can help you build out a project to dive in. Do you have any cases or activations that were successful in the Canadian market? Awesome question. Yeah, a lot of the ones I went through were mostly in the United States, and I don't want to suggest that Canadian activations aren't working. If it's cool, I can follow up with you with something that's a little more Canadian skewed to say, here's the top ones we saw in the Canadian marketplace, kind of weeding out the US stuff. And then that would be kind of the counterpart, whereas we took like that North American view for this call. We got 5 minutes. I'm going to try to hit 2 more questions, and then I'll give you a little bit of time back. I'm just looking here. Teams did well in your findings. How does team performance, like winning and losing, impact sponsor performance? We often say teams are riskier than league deals because they can miss the playoffs or start tanking. Super interesting question. We are fortunate to measure for many brands tons of teams who have either won championships or gone through a tanking cycle. And what typically is the biggest change for us that we see is the reach. So when a team has a championship run, they start adding 10%, 15, 20% reach in their local market as those casual fans come on board. I'll also say conversely, we often see the best sponsorship results in a championship season or in a great, dynasty era, not necessarily during that final moment. And I'm talking about time periods here. So what I'm saying is if a team is dominant during the regular season, is driving great viewership and attendance, often the sponsors are winning during the regular season. When we get to the insanity of a championship, realistically, those moments where a team is maybe counting down the clock to a Super Bowl or an NBA championship, sometimes it's not the best time for consumers to be available to sponsors. It's the one time you've got complete tunnel vision on what's happening on the surface of play. And every brand in that market is jumping on board. Every window in every store is going to be ambushing that property. Fans are delirious, etc. So it's just an interesting thing. It's certainly true. I just wanted to say the sponsors still impact fans with the tanking team. Or a team that's not performing well. They just have to have a message that isn't about celebrating wins. They have to be talking about community, celebrating players, celebrating the great rookies the team has, whatever that might be, and staying relevant. But that the golden period within teams on a heater that sometimes is not necessarily at the parade to start activating, but rather in the lead up to it. What activations did poorly? So I know we did mostly top. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, it was very divisive, but we did track Bud Light's foray into kind of March Madness and Pride with an influencer. We saw as much positivity as we did negativity. So in our data, that was kind of brought it back to neutral, where there was a very polarizing, and I think we all digested the media attention about that, and so I won't labor it. As well as frankly, things that you'd call not massively purposeful activations, just very simple, straightforward assets that don't have any custom messaging or didn't give back to the community or didn't provide the fan any value, but were kind of just brand first. I'm going to stop there. There's a couple extra questions. I know I hope I've done my best to answer these. If I didn't get to something, or I talked about something briefly, or I didn't even talk about something you hoped I'd talk about, we'll be sending out the resources I've shared, a recording in case you want to share it with colleagues. I don't know why, but they could watch it later or whatever. Or you can just reach out to us. SponsorPulse.com. We'll happily get on the phone and share more with you, or see how we can help you get similar data for your category, property, market, you name it. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you for making an hour. Thank you for listening. I hope 1, 2, 3 things landed and will be useful. And yeah, if you'd like to get in touch, we'll be here. We'll end the webinar now so you can start signing off. Thank you.